Welcome to Rates and Barrels. It is Thursday, January 27th. Derek Van Riper here with Eno Saris. On this episode, we have a lot of great questions that have been flowing through the mailbag. We got questions about Stuff Plus and Location Plus and Pitching Plus that we're going to try and answer, which will hopefully shed some light on that model and
I
how
just
we talk about it.
I just saw your cryon for us today on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, it's a limited amount of real estate, but I try to make it as valuable as possible. So I'm proud of myself for once, which is
All right.
okay.
What is the DVR plus going to be on this episode?
That's the question. So other questions include questions about how to use draft capital on prospects in redraft leagues. That is a great path to go down. Some draft and hold questions in there. Honestly, the questions are so large in scope, there's a chance that we don't get to all of them. So we're not going to spend too much time dilly-dallying here at the beginning. Not sure where that expression came from or why I just used it. We do have some show business to attend to. We have an announcement of sorts. It is a promotion, I would say, for the Friday installment of Rates and Barrels as you know it, the show that Eno and Britt and I have been doing together really since the summer of 2020. We've moved that show into the Athletic Baseball Show feed, which is awesome because that Friday show generally focuses more on real baseball and the issues plaguing the sport, the fun things around the sport that are not necessarily fantasy or advanced stats related. So we are now part of the bigger show that The Athletic has. It's awesome. We're going to run on Thursday mornings is when that episode is going to launch. So we'll record midweek, and the videos are going to be available on the Rates and Barrels YouTube page. So if you want those episodes as a podcast, they're in the Athletic Baseball Show feed going forward. But if you want to just watch them on YouTube, we'll have a carousel for that specific show within the Rates and Barrels YouTube page.
Right. So if you just listen to the Rates and Barrels fantasy ones, that's what you're going to get in your podcast feed for Rates and Barrels going forward. But if you did like that other show with Britt, then try us out on YouTube or try out the Athletic Baseball Show. I mean, it's a really good lineup. I mean, it's like the mailbag with Ken Rosenthal. Jason Stark has great guests. Keith Law's on there. I'm honored to be alongside those great names, and we'll just add some levity, and I can't help myself. Like, the advanced stats will come with me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think a lot is going to change about how we approach that episode. I think it's going to be very similar. So if you liked it the way it was, then congratulations. It's going to be very similar. And I think the other thing to keep in mind too, if there's anything we want to do that is somehow too fun for that feed, it will still happen here. Britt is part of the Rates and Barrels family. She always will be. So, we'll have our holiday specials, right? If we're going to do a Christmas movie draft again, something like that probably fits better on Rates and Barrels than it does on the Athletic Baseball Show. Unless, if Ken and Keith and Jason and Doug and everybody over there, if they're all into that, then, we can have a big happy family version of something like that too. But that's the big change. It's exciting. It's a promotion. It's an upgrade. It's a good thing. And we're really excited about it. And it gives us, I think, a little more wiggle room within the feed here to potentially grow with more fantasy stuff in the future should circumstances, time, all those things actually allow us to do that. So it seems like kind of a win-win really for
But it was
everything we're
always
trying to do.
a little bit awkward. I mean, for us or for anybody, probably, to kind of switch gears on Fridays. I mean, Rates and Barrels is nominally a fantasy podcast.
And thank you to those of you who listen who still don't play fantasy baseball, who've
Yeah,
never
that's
played
why,
fantasy
that's why
baseball.
I
It
threw
is
that nominally in
amazing.
there.
We're very grateful that we've found a way to talk about this game in a way that is engaging and fun for people who don't even spend the time playing 5x5 or head to head or any of the things that we ever get into. So that's the big announcement at this point. So be sure to check out the Athletic Baseball Show. First episode that moved over actually showed up this morning. So we're finishing off a series from that podcast, going team by team through each division, talking about what the rest of the offseason will look like once the lockout is over. It's an AL East episode for anybody who's interested in that. But let's get to
and one of the lowlights is my budget plan for the Yankees.
Oh my God, that was my favorite part of the episode. Like, without
I would just
question.
love the Yankees to roll that out and see how people think of it. The Raisian plan for the Yankees.
Yeah. Would love to see Yankees Twitter that day. And by love to see it, we'll definitely avoid Twitter that day if they follow the plan that you outlined on that pod. So there's some questions came in from Bill in Toronto, who is battling snowstorms and typical winter cold in Toronto. So he's got a lot of questions about Stuff Plus and Pitching Plus and Location Plus. And I know when we talk about it, it's one of those topics that I think can be a little frustrating for some people because as a model, it does have a little bit of a black box sort of feel to it. We're trying to be mindful of that. We're not trying to present anything as a be all end all to the conversation or the, hey, the Stuff Plus number is good, draft this guy, we're out of here. Like, that's not ever what we're trying to do. It's just a model that I think is designed to help us better understand what's really happening under the hood, so to speak, what is going on with the pitcher's arsenal and kind of tracking how impactful pitches can be and just kind of looking at it through almost a more granular sort of lens and quantifying nastiness, quantifying command, quantifying location, like quantifying some things that previously I think were in scouting reports, but not necessarily is easy to measure pitcher by pitcher in a very clear and kind of scientific way.
I had a analytics mailbag go up today with Lindsay Adler, and one of the questions kind of was like, how can we play along? How can we follow along? And I think the easiest answer I have for you, because there are, this isn't a model that produces easy mottos or like, easy one-line takeaways. The best I can do for you in that regard is vertical movement is a little bit more important than horizontal movement. Velocity matters. And a lot of other stuff matters too. But one thing that is kind of cool is on the Savant page, there's a movement profile for each pitcher, and it's color coded. And I may not agree with Tom Tango on every single one of his decisions when it comes to the color coding, but generally I agree with him. So if you want to look at Jesus Luzardo's page, and that's why I also wanted to mention that vertical movement is more important than horizontal movement. If you look at Jesus Luzardo's StatCast page, you see a lot of blue in the vertical movement. I mean, it's just all blue. And I think that's helpful on the very base level to say, why is this guy who throws 94 seems to have a good out pitch, why from the left side? Like, why is he having so much trouble? Well, look at all that blue in the movement. And, it's not just the velocity that matters anymore. And, it is maybe unfortunate that as we dive deeper and deeper into pitching, we find all these seam shift away, like the grips matter. And like, that's just not something that it's super easy to like, because even with that, like we carry the stat axis delta, and that's the difference between the inferred move spin axis and the observed spin axis. That's already like a mouthful, right? But then on top of that, it's not always more is better. Because it's a difference, it can go negative and positive, right? And sometimes it's better to be far from the mean. And it could be very negative, very positive, or both good. So it is what it is. We try to explain things as much as possible. When you're looking for changes, I would look for changes in those color-coded Savant pages. I would look for changes on Brooks. And the very base thing that you can do is, if you notice that a player is pitching differently, you can go to Brooks, you can go to Savant, and you can see if there is a difference in their movement profile from the year before, or their pitch mix. Those are the two. That's the basic toolbox right there. And be like, oh my God, he's throwing a slider 40% of the time this year. He threw it 20% of the time last year. That's a more believable breakout to me than the guy who's throwing all the same pitches at all the same movements and for some reason has better results this year. So anyway, I've lost the plot again.
I think pitch usage, velocity, and changes in movement, those are things that are much easier to just go look at on any player's page, thanks to Savant, thanks to Brooks, thanks to these different tools that are out there. So it's important to keep in mind that it's not just here's the number, trust it. It's look and see these changes as they're happening, and you're going to end up in a very similar sort of place now.
And we are still working on some sort of Stuff Plus app within The Athletic. I just have to tell you, there's a lot of moving parts. It's a complicated process. It's almost like a merger of corporations. So, and there happens to be another merger of corporations happening above it. So there's limited resources on the legal team. Anyway, that's too much information, but hopefully we'll get it together pretty soon.
Next Thursday, we will literally show everyone how to make sausage. So the Bills questions, we were talking about Stuff Plus and Location Plus probably at the beginning of January, and we were discussing relievers when you brought up the point that Pitching Plus for relievers is better than projections. And later in the same show, you mentioned that Stuff Plus is stickier year to year than Pitching Plus. So guys like Blake Trinan and Aaron Loop rank much higher based on Stuff Plus than they do on Pitching Plus, even though, as Bill points out, they do very well on both. Should we be looking more at Stuff Plus or Pitching Plus when planning our relievers and kind of choosing who to take chances on, either as discounted closers or as maybe non-closer relievers who could emerge to take on more prominent roles?
Apologies. We were testing the model, so we tested Pitching Plus, but I do think that he's connecting the dots correctly here. I think we're talking about the same thing. I agree with his general line of thought that Stuff Plus is stickier year to year. It becomes meaningful very quickly, and we're talking about relievers who have small samples. They by definition small samples. So I would hew closer to Stuff Plus. I did a sort for minimum. I think it was 300 pitches. For relievers, and looked at the Stuff Plus, and then I picked, usage still matters. That's one of the things that Derek Carty always found when he tried to test all these things against saves, and he was like, that prior experience doesn't matter. This doesn't matter. This doesn't matter. You know what matters? Usage. Who's being used in the 8th inning, ends up getting called up to the 9th. So I would add that I do think, Stuff Plus for relievers matters. It's how teams make decisions. It's how they assign people. It's how they trade for people. In fact, if you look at, for example, Seattle, they're all over the top 10 in Stuff Plus, with Yohan Ramirez at 7 and Paul Sewald at 8. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. That, given what I know about their pitching development, their analytics, but. So I would look at the Stuff Plus list and then look at guys that are either undervalued closers, like Bill says, or 8th inning, 7th inning guys that could get the call up. So to me, the names that stood out were Jake Cousins, 2nd in Stuff Plus, Yohan Ramirez, who was 7th in Stuff Plus, doesn't look as good by Pitching Plus because he had an 89 Command Plus, Location Plus. That's I think that can fluctuate. Not only can it fluctuate because he's a reliever and it's a small sample, but 89 is fringe, and fringe Location Plus changes more than sort of, 97 to 105, which is kind of the meaty Location Plus. That's more reliable. When it comes to 89 Location Plus, he could jump up to 95 next year, and that would be huge for him as a reliever. So that's a little bit tough, though, because Paul Sewald is right there next to him. And I've found that buying into the Mariners bullpen, especially in like a draft and hold, where you're trying to like, hey, can I buy 2 guys and maybe shut down and own that bullpen? I kind of have a hard time identifying like the 2 guys I would want in the Seattle bullpen. I like Paul Sewald and Yohan Ramirez, but you might draft both of those guys late and still miss. So it's a tough bullpen to do that for. But another name that sticks out for me is Jordan Romano, 16th in Stuff Plus, and he's not being treated as a lockdown closer, and I think he's one of the last in that tier. I have Jordan Romano as my first closer in some teams where I kind of let that one sit for a while. But I feel good about it because I think Romano is lights out, and you can easily pair Romano with Julian Merriweather, who's a top 50 reliever by Stuff Plus, where, I'd like those 2 guys as a possible handcuff, as they call it. A couple other names are Andrew Kittredge. He's going to get saves. People don't like him because of the velocity, but Stuff Plus loves him. Tanner Scott had a 4.5, 5 ERA last year for Baltimore, but the walls are coming in, and everyone likes Wells, but it could be Scott. And then Luis Garcia and Giovanni Gallegos are 2, top 50 Stuff Plus guys that I think are closers.
Yeah, Gallegos, I think, is just being a little overdrafted right now.
He's the one that has the highest ADP out of all of these names I said almost.
Yeah, I think him and Romano are probably the two most pricey on a pretty consistent basis. I'm with you on Romano being a little underdrafted right now relative to what he's done and what appears to be a decent hold on the job in Toronto. Seattle's a really difficult place to speculate. That's part of the problem with some of the teams that are stacking up relievers that pop in a model like this is they have 4 or 5 options to use in a spot like that. And I do think trying to crack the code, understanding what matters to a team is more or less what you're doing here with this number, and then seeing the actual usage pattern and trying to break it from there is probably the best way to solve the who actually gets the role question. That's where I'm worried about Gallegos. For so long, I thought he was the best reliever in St. Louis, and he wasn't their closer. And he was good enough to use when he wasn't closing, but that's because the price was cheaper than it was right now. So that's the problem I've run into with him this draft season. It's not that I don't like him as a pitcher, it's that we've seen some past usage that makes me worry that even a more analytics forward manager, which is the case now with Ali Marmol over Mike Schilt, Gallegos might just be the guy that pitches at the most important late inning moment regardless. And it might be 15 saves instead of 35, even though he's capable of getting 35 if they were to use him the way that the Brewers used Josh Hader in 2021, for example. So
there's a little
yeah.
bit of a Mariners thing going on in St. Louis too, honestly, because Jordan Hicks, scores well by this, and Reyes scores well by this. So it's like 3 options. Other teams that do really well, if you want to talk about that kind of team aspect, which I think is really interesting. The Dodgers are all over this. Trinan has the best stuff plus of any reliever in baseball. But Gratterall's not far behind. Hudson was I think the second best stuff plus among free agent relievers. Even without Jansen, they've put together a good bullpen again. And then the Astros, Enoli Paredes and Ryan Stanek show up as possible values, but Pricey is like a top 10 guy. So it's like, but all this is by stuff plus, but yeah, I would love to say Enoli Paredes, especially because his name is Enoli, and I'm a cannoli away from being Enoli. But I don't necessarily think that Presley's at a risk for losing his job. So it is interesting to kind of think about the team aspects, but sometimes those good bullpens do create more save opportunities, and the guys atop them are better for it. Pricey is better because he has Paredes and Stanek behind him and so on. But at the same time, it does make it hard to kind of corral the whole bullpen if you're trying to do that.
Well, I think it sheds some light on the what happens if Pricey gets hurt sort of question, because he's so safe compared to so many other closers. I don't think I spend as much time analyzing who's next up there as I would in some of those committee situations or for teams that don't necessarily have a great pitcher in that role right now. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Like, it might just be an unfortunate injury that opens the door for someone like Paredes to get saves. Maybe he isn't draftable right now, but he's the guy that you're ready to take the chance on when Fab rolls around early in the season, if in fact Pricey goes down. In the same pod, you mentioned Stuff Plus is stickier year to year than Location Plus. And if Bill recalls correctly, you have some Location Plus data from past years. If Location Plus isn't as sticky, it might be more likely to regress to the mean, assuming you have enough history to have any sense of what a player's past level is. Does that open up an opportunity to rank starters by 2021 Stuff Plus and then look at the starters whose 2021 Location Plus was well below either 2020 or 2019, 2020 to identify the potential bounce back players? If so, who could those bounce back players be?
Yeah, I mean, in the spirit of the question, at the top of the rankings, there are some players like Joe Musgrove and Jack Flaherty that had better years. Even Aaron Nola had better years by Location Plus in the past. So that could have been. I mean, Musgrove had an excellent season, so I don't think he needs to bounce back. But it does factor into my appraisal of them going forward. But the way that I use it mostly is that near the end of my rankings, I will start doing a sort where I just sort and see who's the best stuff plus guy that I haven't put in the rankings yet. And often it's because they have low location plus numbers, and then I can say, well, if this regresses upward, or if they make a tweak there, if the location plus is better next year, then, or if we don't know his true talent location plus just yet, then these are good players to target. So that's still Christian Javier for me. Nate Pearson is the poster child for this, because he was up to 102 late in the season. His stuff plus is really good, but he's got like a 91 location plus, but we don't have that much information on him. So the other two names that I really think about when I think about this are Edward Cabrera and Tony Gonsolin, both guys that are going to be available late in your drafts. They had above average stuff plus. They have struggled with command in their past, but Edward Cabrera has some really tiny walk rates in the minor leagues, and that doesn't mean that necessarily he's got great command, but it does mean that he's had better years, or he's had better strategies in the past where he hasn't walked that many. And Gonsolin's we've seen him yo-yo. Honestly, like, we've seen him be like a perfectly acceptable starter and then lose it all in the playoffs. So what if the yo-yo goes in the other direction? He seems to be like maybe the third or fourth starting pitcher in Los Angeles right now. So the opportunity's never been greater. So those are a bunch of names that I think of when I think that's an excellent question, because it gets to my ranking process. Because we did so much testing with Pitching Plus and saw how powerful it was, these ranks will hew closer to Pitching Plus, but I use Stuff Plus a lot at certain points, and you'll see in the rankings where you're like, oh, around 75, 80, he just like did that sort again, where he like, here are all the Stuff Plus guys that could pop, and injury is the same way. I'm getting injury projections from Jeff Zimmerman this year again. He's giving me projected days on the IL. What you'll see is because what happens is, like Clayton Kershaw, right? You have to put him somewhere. So you put him somewhere. And then, I go up and down the rankings. And I'm like, who would I rather have than Clayton Kershaw? And that's, I think, a really important line to draw, because if they are good and going to be healthy, then they have to be above Clayton Kershaw. Right. But if they're not good and just going to be healthy, they're probably going to be below Clayton Kershaw. Right. So there's a lot of you'll see like the injury risk. There'll be some certain lines where like there's little groupings around Clayton Kershaw. Like right now, I'm interested actually where you have Kershaw, and we've lost the plot again, but that's all right. I've got Kershaw at like 40, right? And around him are all these IP risks. Shane Baz, Luis Patino, Alec Manoah. Maybe Manoah didn't need to be there. We'll see. That's still a soft ranking. Michael Kopech, Mike Clevenger. Those are all they sort of, Kershaw was like the magnet for all the IP risks. Where I'm like, oh yeah, this is the part where like you take a shot at a guy who may not have a lot of innings, but should be good if he's in.
Yeah, but then it's also conditional upon what you've done prior to that. Do you have a really stable foundation, or did you already take a little bit of risk with maybe a few younger pitchers, or an ace that has elevated injury risk? Like if you drafted DeGrom, if you felt like DeGrom in round 3 made sense, like you're probably staying away from Kershaw in that spot, because you've already taken on a considerable amount of health risk in the foundation. So that's a consideration too. I think with Kershaw, I'm so pessimistic about his health, which is just...
Oh, so you have him even lower.
It's not fair. I've got him even below Syndergaard and Clevenger. I had him below Severino, even just below Kopech, below Tanner Houck. I mean,
wow.
I'm just not planning on drafting him.
Is he even top 75 for you?
He is. He's 55th right now, and this is an ongoing process. Like,
I'm still working on it.
I'm not married to this, but I have found in the early drafts that I've done, I have never been in a position where I saw Kershaw at the top of the queue, looked at my team and said, "Yep, got to do this right now." I might be reading too much into the Dodgers and the way they've handled him, but if we get out of the lockout and he quickly re-signs with them, that changes quite a bit about my expectations for him, because if they re-sign him, they must have some belief that he's actually
Unless
healthy
they
enough to give
resign
them a
him
good
to a
number of
3-year
innings.
deal and they're just paying for years 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, the story I have for this, that I think the feeling was very much when Kershaw got hurt that, wow, this is a big deal. He's out. He might be out next year. Like, this might be TJ. He got the platelet infusion or whatever, the PRP injection, which I don't know how often that's actually worked in the past. But I keep thinking of Brandon Belt. When Brandon Belt hurt his knee, everybody around the team was like, he's out. It's going to be another knee surgery. It's the knee he hurt before. It's the knee he had surgery before. It looked bad. He can't put any pressure on it. Like, he's out. He's out. He's out. And we talked to him when he came back, and he said, one day I woke up and it felt better. So, yeah, I do think that story could go either way. I mean, you're like, Kershaw woke up one morning and said, no, I got to go get the TJ. So, in that moment, there's going to be a really terrible, awkward moment after they do make an agreement where everybody reports to camp at the same time. And everybody who hasn't been talking to their teams has to then be like, oh yeah, my elbow was barking all off season, but I just ignored it. Or like, oh, I haven't actually thrown for 3 weeks because, I felt some soreness. And you're just like,
And I couldn't tell you.
And they couldn't tell you. And they're not going to necessarily offer that up on their Twitter accounts and stuff. Like,
Nope.
I did get Lance McCullers to say on Twitter that he was throwing again by asking him on Twitter. But yeah, the good news might filter through, but the bad news, we're not going to hear about it until there's going to be a week of transactions and bad news that all of us who are drafting right now are going to be like, damn it. It's going to be tough. So yeah, I guess why lean into that right now? Be as safe as possible right now, because it could be another crap show later.
Yeah, that's where I'm at least as things stand on January 27th. I, like always, reserve the right to make an adjustment if more information, especially of the positive variety, comes to light. There was one other Stuff Plus question that I wanted to throw your way. This one came in from Derek via email, not from me, from a different Derek. What do you do when you see a pitch that passes the eye test but not the Stuff Plus test? He throws Logan Gilbert's curveball and Shane McClanahan's fastball as pitches that stick out to him. Is it possible to project that they are a tweak away from better Stuff Plus and results when pitches look good by the eye test?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. There's a sort of multifaceted answer on there, which is that step one is there are things that are not in this model. So Ian Anderson's changeup rates poorly by Stuff Plus. It is possible that the angle of his forearm, the extreme over the top release, the way he hides the ball, the relationship between his arm angle and the movement that comes out of it, sort of, people expect him to be a north-south guy, and then he actually has some wiggle on his changeup. All of those things are not necessarily explicitly in the model and may not be able to be in the model until we have pose estimation data from Hawkeye, which is to say data about what the angle is on the forearm and what the angle is here. And that stuff exists and teams have it, and teams are working right now on including that into stuff models because most teams have a stuff model and are trying to advance it beyond what we have, and what they're doing is adding body stuff. So that's the first answer to the question, is that this is an evolving model. We're trying to improve it, and there's aspects that aren't captured. So if you feel strongly about Ian Anderson's changeup and the model says it's no good, I mean, just ignore it, man. Like, if you feel strongly, it's not like we've figured pitching out. I've been trying to, but we haven't figured it out. Then there's a step beyond this, which opens maybe shines some light on what the best sort of development labs are doing, which is to say, if you track what you can change in a drill. So you can say, hey, wow, if we do this drill, I just talked to Mike Sun from Pro Play Eye for a piece I'm doing on the future of biomechanics. with Alec Lewis. And in this piece, he said, you can use our app, which it's the app that turns pitchers into like lines, turns them into like little geometric lines. He says, you can use this app to judge the validity of a drill you're doing. So he said, over at the baseball development group in Toronto, they had people that were flying open too early so when they're landing, their trunk was too far forward, right? And so they did a thing called the janitor drill, which is you kind of do the Cueto, right? You show your back to the hitter and you start all the way back and then you turn around and pitch, right? There's deliveries like that. You can imagine what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
And they used this biomechanical analysis that was available to them through the ProPlay app to see, it did change trunk rotation. It had an effect at trunk rotation at football, and it helped us do this thing we're trying to do. So if you line all that up and you say, okay, with this drill, we can do this. With this drill, we can do this. With this grip, we can do this. If you line all that up, then you can start to say, okay, we can reliably give you a half inch of ride. If you come in here, we can find a way to give you a half inch of ride on your four seam. We can find a way to give you 2 inches of sweep on your slider. We can do this and this and this, right? If you line that up, you can actually create a kind of expected or goal stuff plus, like a possibility, a ceiling stuff plus, where you can say, hey, you're right now, you're like 99 stuff plus, and you could probably make a living in baseball and you'd be fine. But we have these 3 tweaks we can make, and we see you as like a 102 stuff plus. And you know what? The best teams are absolutely doing this. And you know what the evidence is? All the guys that like the Rays get, where they're like, hey, we're going to give you 1 target, right? That's like a location plus play where they're like, hey, if we give them 1 target instead of 4 targets, then all of a sudden their location plus numbers are much better. Like Glasnow, right?
Well, and you could probably take a guy that's hitting 1 target more consistently and give him a second target eventually, right?
Right.
Instead of trying to have 4 locations work simultaneously, get 1 to work, and when you got 1, add another. And if you have 2, maybe add another. Like you can build up that way.
Yeah, but Lance Brozdowski has a really cool thing on this on Twitter where he was like, no, they give him 1 target. Glasnow has 1 target. The next time Glasnow pitches, watch. I mean, it's going to be a little bit, but they give him 1 target. And they do this to a fair amount of their pitchers. I bet you Luis Patino has 1 target. But in any case, where I was going with this is the other example is like, why are there teams that seem to like acquire a pitcher, make a little tweak and make him better? That's because in their model, they said, hey, this guy has an X stuff plus right now, but like, we think he can get to Y if we do these 3 drills that we've done in the past, And so that's what the best teams are doing. That's what the Astros are doing, is saying like, well, we know that we can do this for hitters and we can do this for pitchers with these drills. We've proven out with these drills. So we should go out and look for hitters that are missing this aspect, because we think we can coach them up on that. If they're good at all this other stuff, it's almost like, you know what? It's a little bit like the Rays with exit velocity, right? They like to get guys that have plate discipline and exit velocity. And they say, we're going to try and coach the launch angle into you. Yandy Diaz. It worked for a little bit. It didn't work. Maybe it did work. It did work with Randy Arozarena, I think. Like he was a guy who hit too many ground balls, too hard ground balls, but like he's got decent power now. So that's their theory, is like we can coach up launch angle, and if they have the raw plate discipline and exit velocity, then we know we have these drills that can do this. So unfortunately, that's a little bit hard for me to do in the public sphere because I don't have access to all these drills and stuff. But I did think of this question, spur an idea, which is we could look at what changes are most common in baseball and just say, oh, you know what? Last year, 30 pitchers added a half inch of ride. 25 pitchers added an inch of sweep on their slider. So you could just add that in, and have like a peak pitching plus or a peak stuff plus. And then you could do some sorting in our app or in the Google Doc for now. There's a Google Doc of all the location plus and stuff plus from last year. It's in a piece called Why Should Anyone Care About Stuff Plus? If anyone's looking for that. But yeah, if we had like a peak one in there, you could be like, oh, look, Shane McClanahan stuff plus is 103, but peak one is 106 or something. You could kind of find some sleepers that way.
a favor to me as the producer of the show. If you use or look at the show notes, just the little show description that shows up for every episode, whether that's on YouTube or Spotify or Apple, or wherever you listen on your podcast player, if you send us an email or a tweet and just want to indicate, yes, I look at the show notes, no, I don't look at the show notes, that would actually be very helpful just to get a sense for if that space has any value at all. For a while, I didn't think
Put some
anyone used
metrics
it.
on it.
Well,
Exactly.
yeah, I could put like an Easter egg or something in there, but now I said something, so I've already ruined the study. But it's something that's a little bit of an unknown. I feel like that we don't. If it's helpful, I can put more information in there. But if no one's going to use it, I'm not going to take the time to do it. Like
But this
that's
is exactly it. This is the work of player development. You have to be able to put a number on it to know if it's worth anything. Is
right.
this drill that I'm doing, making show notes, is this useful time? You know?
Right. I only have a limited amount of time to do anything. If it's important, I will do it. If it's not important, I will not do it. But thank you for the questions, Bill and Derek. A lot of good stuff there. I just know it's an area that people are always asking questions about. So we're trying to be as helpful as we can to shed more light on what's happening in that space. We had a great question come in from Mitch, and it's about using redraft capital on prospects. He writes he had a topic that interested him that was inspired by a tweet calling out the difference between Bobby Witt and Riley Green's ADPs. Witt goes inside the top 100. Green kind of goes more the back of the top 300, somewhere in that range. The general idea was that both prospects have similar playing time expectations, high ceiling, power speed profiles, and have been plagued by somewhat high strikeout rates throughout their time in the minor leagues. And the point was, why waste precious draft capital by chasing an inflated Bobby Witt Jr. at his ADP when you could just get Riley Green several rounds later? So just as a core concept, early prospects versus later prospects, how often do you go after a prospect that gets that top 100, even top 150 range ADP by the time we get to opening day? Because I've moved a little bit on this over time. So I'm just curious if there's a non-starter sort of rule that you have, if you're case by case. Uh, where are you at on this?
This may not be a popular take, and it may be a blind spot for me, but heck no, man. I'm not in. I'm not in at all. I'm not going to spend a starting spot on my roster in a redraft on a guy that I have no idea if he's going to play this year and how much he's going to play this year. I'm not going to do it. I will do it at the bench level. So, for example, in these DCs, I've done two DCs, which are draft and holds on NFPC. And the only real sort of prospects that fit this discussion that I have are Vidal, Bruján, who I took because I was a little bit short on speed, and I took him in the 24th round of my NFBC, and then MJ Melendez, who absolutely projects to be an awesome hitter and is a really exciting catcher for the Kansas City Royals, who happen to have a guy named Sal Perez. It was a long shot play, but I took him as my fourth catcher. So that's where I'm at. I will take a shot once it gets to the bench levels, whoever's left, if I have an area of weakness. So Vidal, Bruján, I was like, I could have taken other prospects there, but I took Bruján because I was a little bit light on steals, and it was part of a Bruján Robles approach there, where I took a bunch of sixth outfielders that could have some speed. So I'm not into it, man. It's like picking Clayton Kershaw.
I'm more likely right now to overspend on Bobby Witt Jr. than I am to draft Clayton Kershaw at his ADP, just to provide some sort of middle ground. But over time, I have become less willing to take on this type of risk. Now, Witt had an amazing season in the minors, and it was after a slow start, too. We've talked a lot about projections with prospects, how noisy they can be. Part of that's the playing time uncertainty. Part of that is the gulf between AAA and the big leagues right now. I think with Witt, there's a lot of ways he can make value. I would say it's possible that his situation this draft season is more like Ronald Acuna when Acuna broke in. And Acuna, if I remember correctly, Acuna that year was going just outside the top 100, but not much later than Witt's going right now. And if I'm way off on that, feel free to remind me that I'm wrong. It's very difficult to land on a player like that and get the production that we received from Ronald Acuna in year one, right? 2018 is a 20-year-old, 26 homers, 16 steals in 111 games with a 293, 366, 552 line. That
I
is
know, but it's
absurd.
so freaking rare, dude.
That's
Mike
so rare.
Trout was the #1 prospect. He was amazing. He sucked.
Right, but you look at
First year.
Soto and you look at Yordan Alvarez. There are players that have come up and done it. And I would just say because Witt can steal bases, even if the power's not there right away, even if there's a learning curve and the K rate jumps from the low 20s at AAA to the low 30s at the beginning of the season, if you believe the Royals are going to be patient with him, it comes down to how quickly you think he's going to adjust. Generally, I agree with the idea of just not being interested, in part because in a snake draft, it's the opportunity cost that just stares me in the face. Like, I realize dollar for dollar, you're still going to pay quite a bit to get Witt in a salary cap draft auction situation. But if you're looking at the guy next to him in ADP, Chris Bryant, like, who is more likely to return the value you want in that
And
spot?
I think he has more helium than that. In my draft, he went in the 7th, right behind Corey Seager, and ahead of other shortstops like Carlos Correa, Gleyber Torres, Willie Adames. Like, I mean, those guys are pretty good. He also plays a position that is stacked.
The loaded position right now.
So it's not like I need to rush out and get him. That's why MJ Melendez and Vidal Bruján made more sense to me, because they, Bruján, if he hits, could steal like 35, 40 bases. And then, like, that's going to be crazy valuable. And with regards to his cost, I got him 17 rounds later. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like, oh, this guy in the 7th, this guy in the 10th. It's like, I don't know. I can't do it. And I've got Jeff Zimmerman in my ear. Playing time is king, and playing time on a prospect like that it's a binary thing. You either win the lottery or you just wasted that pick.
Where would Witt really have to be going where you'd start to change your tune? Would it be 50 picks later? Would it be 100 picks later? Like, how much of an overdraft do you think he is, considering the projection, which, the Bat X projections are now out along with ATC over on the pages at Fangraphs. If you look at Bobby Witt Jr.'s projection from the Bat X, that's the most pessimistic of the systems over there, 248, 18 bombs, 14 steals. That's in 127 games. It's possible he plays a little more than that. It's a good power speed combo. It's an average that doesn't hurt you. That's worth having on your team in most mixed leagues that we play in, for sure. So it's not even a matter of, is he rosterable or not? It's just a question of how much are you willing to overpay relative to that projection for the possibility that it all clicks and 25-25 happens right away, because that's in the range of outcomes, even if it's a relatively unlikely one from the jump.
Okay, so we're gonna do this guy, not this guy, but this guy 5 rounds later.
Yeah, because when you
how about Ahmed Rosario in the 11th?
See, at that point, if Witt was going down where Rosario was going, I could pretty easily talk myself into Witt, and everyone listening is like, "Of course you'd take Witt there." Well, okay, so we're probably talking about 50 picks in ADP, because if you put him in the
because that's extreme for me. That in that case, that would be almost, it's like 65 picks.
Even Witt
between
versus
Witt and
Kelnick,
Rosario. But
like
yeah,
Kelnick,
I'd say 50 is decent. Yeah.
Witt versus Kelnick to me is kind of an interesting toss-up. And we've seen Kelnick come up and go through some struggles already, but start to make the adjustments. So, I think
he went 1 round later. So he went, 15 picks later, basically.
The core of the question was driving at
But see,
similar.
I don't think that Kelnick, I mean, I do think, Kelnick, but Kelnick is going to play.
Kelnick's playing time is safer by comparison, but how much safer is it?
I guess he could go back down.
Yeah, if he slumps badly, Kelnick can still get options.
Yeah.
So the core of the question was looking more at someone like Jose Barrero, whose AAA numbers in 2021 are fairly similar to Witt's. I mean, Barrero's 2 years older for the level. That's a huge difference in terms of ceiling potential that needs to be accounted for. But does that fully justify a 300 pick difference in where they go? I mean, with Barrero, he might have to be more of a super utility guy. Kyle Farmer played well enough to probably have some share of the job at shortstop to begin the season. So you're taking on playing time risk, but if you're taking on playing time risk, you'd take it on in the 300 and 400 range if the skills are right. So I just think it's an interesting way to think about it. Like if you look at guys that played well in the minors who go a lot later than some of their counterparts, you can find some value. The other example that I thought was pretty interesting from the position player side was, Spencer Torkelson kind of goes in the mid 200s, and you get guys like Nick Prado and Tristan Casas who go 200 picks later. For me, I think Torkelson's floor is more like what we saw from Andrew Vaughn last year, and his ceiling is probably higher than Prado and Casas by a decent margin, and quicker path to playing time. Even though Nick Prado looks ready to play in the big leagues, you talked about MJ Melendez a few minutes ago. They still have Carlos Santana. They have Sal. They have Melendez. They have Prado. So it's hard to see how all of those guys fit together right now.
Even
so you may have to wait.
Pascantino. I
Yes.
messed up his name, I'm sure.
Vinny.
Yeah, let's call him Vinny.
VP.
Yeah, and then we had a question about this guy, and I hate to just mention it in passing and not use it in case we need content. But what I prefer to do rather than those guys is get those guys a year later after they've maybe struggled or played 100 innings. They have less luster. So my example of that is Brandon Marsh, who I got in the 22nd. I wouldn't even be surprised if there were a lot of leagues where he went ahead of the 22nd last year when he was a prospect, right? As opposed to this year when, he's actually probably got playing time in front of him. And then on top of that, you have some information about what they've done at the major league level with some stats that can be useful in small samples. For example, Brandon Marsh had a 10% barrel rate. That's very good. I'm all over that. His strikeout rate it wasn't nasty. It's not great, but it wasn't nasty. And he had some patience. So like he didn't swing at a bunch of stuff outside of the zone. These are all things that become meaningful pretty quickly. So I'd much rather take Brandon Marsh there. And in fact, I wasn't even planning on taking Bruján, but he dropped like 200 or 100 below his ADP. And at some point I was like, well, I do need to steal them. Fine. I'll go for it. But that's what I'm like, the post-hype sleeper, quote unquote. I'm a little bit more about that than the hype sleeper.
I think the best counter argument to Witt, if you don't want to buy the opportunity cost and the quality of the other players that go in the same range, is that Julio Rodriguez goes 150 picks later. And yes, Witt played at AAA last year. Rodriguez didn't. But Julio Rodriguez is the third best projected position player by WRC Plus for the Mariners this year. I mean, if they have any designs on going to the playoffs and improving upon what they did last year, we talked about the limitations of that lineup on our last episode. He's part of the plan. Like he has to be part of that. So
if the rules don't change much, he's a huge candidate for like a May, June call up.
Right. And you'll get Witt sooner. Like I'd be stunned if the Royals made Witt wait more than 12 or 14 days or whatever they decide to do.
Oh yeah, there's that first bit, right? There's like 2.5 weeks into the season. Then there's the Super 2. 2.5 weeks in the season, you can try to manipulate it so they don't get the full year of service time, right? But then 2 months into the season is the Super 2, where you try to manipulate whether or not they get arbitration in their third year or not.
Yeah, if that's still a thing. So
right,
I'd much rather try to catch lightning in a bottle around pick 250 with Rodriguez than give up what I think is a much more valuable pick on a similarly risky profile. I I mean, long term, if you just said Dynasty, who do you prefer, Rodriguez or Witt? I think I'd take Rodriguez straight up anyway. And I think they're closer in skills right now than the draft market would lead us to believe. So
there was a lot of debate at Baseball Prospectus about the top three, Rutschman, Rodriguez, and Witt. And I think they went Witt, Rutschman, Rodriguez. And to me, it's Rodriguez, Witt, Rutschman.
do you think a lot of that, though, is also factoring in where those guys play? I mean, Rodriguez, if he's a right fielder compared to being a shortstop or a catcher and accounting for real life value playing up the middle versus playing in a corner, that to me could be a part of that too.
Yes, true. It's a real life list. That's a good point. And Rutschman's value as a catcher could be huge. It's true.
Yeah, so I think the last part of Mitch's question is, have you guys noticed an opportunity to pick up value in drafts by avoiding brand name prospects and taking prospects later with similar profiles?
100%.
Yeah, generally, yes. I think so. The other example in his email, Nick Lodolo going 100 picks behind Hunter Green. I mean, that's two guys coming through the same organization, pitching at the same levels. Lodolo versus Green, it's a little more of a ceiling versus floor sort of argument. I think most analysts would tell you that Hunter Green's potential is greater. But Nick Lodolo is probably safer just because of command, and the depth of the arsenal maybe is a little bit better. I don't know if that makes a huge difference for me. I think they're both draftable because I think if Sonny Gray ends up getting traded, there's a
Castillo.
very easy path for both of those guys to start. Yeah, Castillo could be traded. I mean, there's so many paths for
but
those guys.
again, there's like a case to be made for, getting Reaver San Martin instead, because, if you look at the innings pitched for Hunter Green and Nick Lodolo over the last 3 years, it's very sparse. So how many innings are you going to actually get?
Yeah, it's going to probably be a tad on the light side. And 2020, it's still going to wreak some havoc on us just as far as getting a feel for workloads and really understanding where players are at in terms of development. I think a lot of guys had sluggish starts in 2021 in the minors because of the long layoff, and where they go in 2022 and how quickly they start could actually change a lot about how we view those players going forward. The guys that had the hype previously that don't have it right now are always interesting to me. And I think we could probably say Joe Adele fits into that group now too.
Two guys on one team, Marsh and Adele.
Marsh and Adele. I mean, Adele ADP in the last 2 weeks or so, just outside the top 225. You're looking at him versus Vaughn versus Jesus Sanchez versus Adam Duvall versus Harrison Bader versus Lane Thomas. Like, isn't that weird that we've reached the point where Joe Adele versus Lane Thomas is a redraft question? Like, I know we talked about Justin Upton as kind of a forgotten veteran who still brings a lot of power. If you have Upton and you have Trout and you have Brandon Marsh, who's important because he can play center field, that can lead to a little bit of a playing time crunch that hurts Adele. But Adele did improve the strikeout rate in a big way last year. And is he any more risky playing time wise than Lane Thomas? Like, I don't think so.
Yeah, there's some other names I kind of like. Baum. I think he still has some ability, though he's pretty poor defensively, and that's really tough. But if there's an NLDH, I think he gets a boon there. Gavin Lux is like the definition of a post type sleeper, although he still gets a decent ADP.
Second time he's landed in this space.
Yeah, right. Perpetual
post type
sleeper.
Still sleeping. Yeah, I mean, he's outside the top 200 with the Muncy situation that we've talked about, with Seager leaving and just shuffling pieces around. As it stands right now, he looks like he's going to play a lot. So I'd be pretty optimistic about Lux at this point. What do you think about Jarren Duran?
I just have a little bit of that bias against players. Oh, Austin Riley last year would have counted.
Yep.
That's an interesting one. Obviously doing a Google search while on the cast. Shut up, yeah, Duran, I just have the bias against high strikeout rates. I maybe need to keep reinvestigating that bias, but I do know that like teams that don't strike out that much do better, and that I think that his strikeout rate was part of the reason why he didn't really take the role and run with it last year.
I think the question is still interesting though, because if you again look at projections, look at the WHIP projection at 248, 302, 421, 18 homers, 14 steals, and you look at Duran, a little less playing time, but 257, 316, 410, 10 homers, 12 steals. Yes, that's not as good. Old for the level relative to WHIT too, so that has to be
But the
accounted
price
for.
is totally different.
Price is a lot different, and he has a lot of ways to make value, especially if they don't add another bat to the equation. I think he'll end up playing quite a bit. A lot of my interest in Duran at his current price hinges on them not adding another impactful player,
especially in the outfield, because I think Kike is best used at second right now, because I don't know that Christian Arroyo is a full-time starter at that position. So if Kike is best used at second right now, center field is Jackie Bradley Jr. and Duran. And actually right now, Duran is the starting left fielder as well.
Depth charts are fun.
They could actually probably add one more outfielder and Duran would still be a decent sleeper.
I think in that scenario, his buffer for not hitting just gets smaller. Whereas currently,
it's not like Jackie Bradley Jr. hits every year.
Well, Bradley.
All it takes is a bad slump from Bradley to start the season, and then they decide he's done, and here comes Duran.
But thanks a lot for that question, Mitch. Definitely a lot of value to be had in some of the other prospects, the non-WHIP prospects, especially guys that were prospects a year ago that have lost that and have now kind of settled into a discounted price. This is a question here from Cody about draft and hold. He's got his first draft and hold draft coming up in February. He doesn't really know what to do. Referred to himself as a noob and addressed us as non-noobs. And I think that's fair. I'm not an expert in draft and hold by any stretch of the imagination, but I've hopefully played it enough to not do dumb things. I think the biggest question is, how do you build out a roster, a 50 slot roster? You've talked about having 4 players eligible to cover each position. That's a great place to be. You do that in part with some multi-eligible position players. In some instances, it's just drafting 4 catchers because you don't have a lot of multi-position eligible guys that can catch. So you have to factor that into consideration. I think it ends up being between 26 and 30 hitters most of the time. Like a 28-22 split is the ideal split, but you have to adjust that in either direction based on how much risk you have within the pitching staff.
There will be a last pick. There will be a last 3-round pick where you're like, ooh, I ended up light here, and so I'm just gonna I'm gonna shift one bat, one pitcher, But the way you put yourself in position to do that is multi-eligibility. But like I said, you don't have to pay for the multi-eligibility. You don't have to pay for Jake Cronenworth, just because of the multi-eligibility. So I think at the beginning, what I just focus on is getting the best players. You'll have a starting lineup, right? Like you're going to have a season that starts and you're going to have just the starting lineup. So you kind of want your starting lineup to be as good as possible. And then you kind of shift into, okay, all right, I need to have 4 of each. I want to have at least 3 bodies at each position, each infield position. But 4 eligible at each infield position, 4 catchers, 10 outfielders, 16 starters, and 6 relievers. But sometimes you'll want to go to 7 relievers because you waited on saves. That's the toggle that happens if you don't spend up on saves like everybody else. And you'll notice like Hader will go in like the 2nd round or 3rd round. Like you're going to be like, whoa, why are the saves going so fast? It's because you don't have the waiver wire. And so you need to have some sort of save strategy. And what I do is a modified punt. I don't do a full punt. I don't think it's possible to win like that. But I get like Romano. I got Romano and Bednar, the 2 guys that show up really good in my model that I got in sort of the 8th, 9th, 10th, those sort of rounds. And I felt like I did enough that I could only have 6 relievers. But if you punt even further, then you're going to need to have 7 relievers because you need more darts. And you're going to have to throw more darts. And that's going to cost you either in your 16 starters, starting pitchers, or it's going to cost you a position player. So that's the kind of that's the rubric I've fallen on. I think it's a pretty good one. I did pretty well last year. And it's pretty time tested. Within those 3 or 4, I would want it's okay to take those, like we were just talking about the prospect shots, right? It's okay to take prospect shots, but I wouldn't take like multiple prospect shots within a position, because then your guys will get hurt, your stars will get hurt, and then you'll be like, oh crap, I had 4 shortstops, but my 2 starting shortstops are hurt, and the other 2 were prospects,
Yeah.
right? So, like one of the guy that ended up being really kind of important for my strategy was Taylor Walls, because I think Taylor Walls is going into the season as a shortstop, but I think he's going to play at third. And I know he'll play at second. So now I've got a guy who's going to have 3 eligibilities at some point in the season, and he's going to play. And even if he becomes a backup, he's going to be their super utility guy. He's going to play. And so, he can be a guy that has some upside, but he backs up like 3 positions for me, and he didn't cost that much. So identify players that you think might add eligibility, or multi-eligible guys that aren't expensive. And those are really great guys to start adding in the middle, to be like, okay, I just backed up 3 positions as one guy. Bam.
Yeah. And I would also try and count the players that are dealing with injuries right now. I would count them like prospects. So if you happen to like the price on Clayton Kershaw, that's 1 fewer prospect you're going to draft later, just because you're taking a massive playing time risk due to injury. I think you can get by with maybe 4 out of 50 roster spots, 4 to 5 at most, where you're taking on considerable risk. So if you had, let's say you had an infield prospect, an outfield prospect, and 2 pitching prospects, and then maybe like 1 guy that has really high injury risk, but you feel like on a per game or per inning basis, you're getting great value. That's about as much as you can possibly have as known injury playing time risk going into the season that way. Because if those things don't break your way, and then the new injuries that hit your team hit, you are going to be in a spot where you're playing some very sketchy players in the lineup. And this often comes down to who does best in the battle of attrition, who has the most available playing time on their bench that they can lean on. So just be really careful with the number of shots you take. I'm with Eno. I wouldn't punt a category completely. I probably spend a little more early draft capital on closers than you do, but I am comfortable going into a league like this only having maybe 1 out of my top 8, one of my circle of trust relievers, and then taking shots after that. Because even if I finish middle of the pack in saves, that's fine. That'll play. I don't have to win the category. I don't even necessarily have to be top 3 in the category to win at least the individual league. But I think punting categories ends up putting you in a horrible spot, especially in leagues where you can't make in-season moves to tinker and make more adjustments. I think punting is an in-season thing that you do in leagues with moves when something's not going well. When you happen to draft Adalberto Mondesi for half your steals and he gets hurt and you can't find steals, then you punt steals because you can trade away some steals to someone else, get strong in another category, and then supplement what you need on the wire. But punting in a format like this is also a bad idea. So I would try to avoid that if you can.
And then lastly, there's the three potential holes, like the 3 places where you kind of almost have to pick a weakness, right? Like it's a 15-team league. It's going to be tough, and you're going to have a strategy about one of these. So saves, we talked about. You either got to spend up and not get some of the position players you wanted because you're getting saves that you think are locked down. First base is tricky. First base goes higher than you might expect. You might say, oh, Luke Voigt by the auction calculator, still $10 guy. He's still out there. I'm fine. Then Luke Voigt goes and you go, oh, I didn't look behind him. Man. And that's how I ended up with Luis Diaz as my 3rd first baseman. And Josh Naylor is my 4th first baseman. He's not even eligible there yet. So in my draft, I picked the weakness of first base, basically, I think, with a minor weakness at saves. But that's the 2. Is there a 3rd one? Can you think of a 3rd one? Yeah, speed. That's it. Steals. So in my draft, what I tried to do was a modified punt of all 3. We'll see how it goes. I just told you my first base board is Jared Walsh, Schwindel, Luis Diaz in Florida, and Josh Naylor, who's not eligible there. So that's the modified punt. I like Walsh and Schwindel, but like it's not the best first base group, right?
I would put first base and third base as higher priority positions than they have been in the past. Because when you think about the way teams handle first base in particular, if they don't have a Vlad, a Freeman, an Olsen, a Goldschmidt, an Alonso, an Abreu, someone who plays that spot every day. I mean, Walsh, I think, does make that cut. I think that's about as thin as you can cut it. Maybe Josh Bell and CJ Crone and Rhys Hoskins, Joey Votto are like the bottom here. Everybody else, every other team moves guys around quite a bit. And they'll platoon. And when you have platoons, you're going to lose playing time.
Third, there are more multi-eligible third guys than there are first base guys.
Right. That's why I think you can get away with waiting a little more at third base, because the wait at third base options, they might not be everyday third baseman, but because they play multiple spots, they come closer to everyday playing time than your platooned first baseman do.
Yeah. Like I added Nico Horner, David Bodie, and Josh Van Meter late, and they're all going to have third base and second base eligibility. And, I think to some extent. And so they show up as second baseman on anything, but they were my backup third baseman as well. So I'm not as worried about third base. First base is tough because of what we're talking about. Then my saves guys. So this is the modified punt everything strategy, just to kind of show my work. My saves guys are Romano, Melanson, Bednar, Luis Garcia in San Diego, Julian Merriweather as a handcuff for Romano, and JP Fireeisen in Tampa Bay. Not the best group, but definitely not the worst group. Definitely not the worst group in that in there.
I have one other idea, theory, argument, point, something to put out there as it pertains to roster construction. And one of the reasons why I'm inclined to at least have one closer in my circle of trust, and why I'm not afraid to burn the extra draft capital to get two if it breaks the right way for me. I'd rather not have to roster 6 or 7 relievers trying to get to that midpoint in saves. If I draft too early, I'm probably only drafting 2 more total relievers and just running with 4 relievers all season. So if I have 2 of my top 8, if I have a Pricey and Romano combination, right? If I get those 2 guys, I'm not going overboard. I'm not going Hader Hendricks necessarily in that draft because I like the value of the hitters and go in there instead, or the starting pitchers. But I get 2 out of my first 8. I'm probably drafting a lot less of those darts later. And then I have that extra depth I want, or I can afford to take the extra shot on a prospect or an injured guy that might actually pop to fill a need elsewhere, right? So if the cost of getting the 2 top 8 closers ends up being that I waited a little more on starting pitching, maybe in that build, I'm more inclined to then take a late flyer on a Mike Soroka or someone who I do have to wait for, but once he's back, I'm expecting top 20 quality innings from. Like, I think that's the type of decision I'm comfortable making because of what it allows me to do later. It's not just getting the saves, it's that I have more darts to throw in other places that might actually be more valuable in the long run. And ultimately, I like having that extra flexibility.
The only retort I have is that, I was surprised. I'm kind of a deep league aficionado, so maybe it's not that surprising, but I had like 20 players left on my queue when the thing ended. Like I still was like, ooh, there's still guys out there. And a lot of them were relievers. There's a ton of relievers you can get in the end game. So I don't think I would necessarily limit. I don't think I would necessarily stop at 4 or 5 relievers. I think 6 is a good number. But it is kind of maybe an argument for get 2 really good ones, and then don't worry about relievers for a long time because they are going to be there for you at the end, especially with this powerful pitching plus model at your back.
Right. The difference between the dart you're going to throw in round 28 versus round 48 is actually pretty small based on who's still there in the end game. So that's where I'm at.
For me, it was, that would be Luis Garcia, who I got, I had to actually pay a little bit for in the 29th round. And then my next reliever was Julian Merriweather in the 41st. Is there that much of a difference between them? They're both talented guys. Could close, could not.
One more question to get to from Jay Good, and it's actually a trade question for a Dynasty League. It's an 18-team Dynasty League. that uses OBP, K percentage, and extra base hits. The question is simple. Is it Vidal Bruján or Kyle Schwarber? The context: the sun is setting on some of the stars of my multi-title team, but I have some youngsters on the rise, and my pitching is solid. So which side of Vidal Bruján or Kyle Schwarber are you on in an 18-team Dynasty League right now that uses OBP?
I mean, Bruján's surprisingly not, like, for his profile, not going to help you necessarily in strikeout rate, and not surprisingly not going to help you in extra base hits. So it's possible that in this setup, he's not that valuable of a piece.
You feel good about your speed. The thing I would keep in mind is that OBP helps Schwarber. He owns that skill. His OBP will always stack up a lot better than his average. Power, like it's interesting. If you switch from average to OBP, Kyle Schwarber is basically Manny Machado without the speed. That's the difference. That's a pretty big jump from where he is in average when you bring him down and he's more like a Rhys Hoskins in the outfield, probably is the fair sort of comp you could make on Schwarber. It's a big swing in value, actually.
K percentage doesn't help him much either. And the other thing is that, like, speed is just really hard to acquire. The only way to get speed in a Dynasty League is to keep one of your young guys, usually, right?
Yeah. I think in this situation, if I'm looking more toward the future, I'm content to take the Bruján side of this, because one way or another, he's going to play. Like, I think the thing that,
yeah, my understanding is he'll be the Walls and him will be backups at, like, together they'll back up the whole field. They'll play it everywhere.
I mean, the short-term concern is that it's crowded and maybe they don't like him enough in center field to actually play him in center if they move on from Kevin Kiermaier, because they also have Josh Lowe, who is a good center fielder and can just play that spot. So you're worried that you have a super utility playing time share in the short term, but there's a ton of moving parts in Tampa Bay. If Bruján hits, he plays there. If he hits and there's not a spot for him, he's a piece they can use to go get more pitching or whatever it is they decide they need in season. So I see enough paths for Bruján to where if I'm in a rebuild, I prefer him. And that kind of sounds like the situation that Jay is in here.
If the sun is setting, man, don't push it too hard, man. This seems like one of those deals where you're like, I can still win, and your team's old, and you give up a player who 2 years later, you're like, damn it.
Schwarber turns 29 in March, and Bruján will be 24 in February. So maybe he's a little older than people realize, but 5-year gap between them. Speed is hard to find. And I think it also comes back to how much you believe in Bruján just as a pure hitter. You're right. Extra base hits, that's still a question. Is he going to do that consistently? We didn't see a ton of game power from him prior to AAA last year. At least it was Durham, right? It wasn't Albuquerque, it wasn't PCL, but how much do we trust Bruján's power? I think the good news is that power came alongside an improved ground ball rate. Like earlier in his career, Bruján was hitting the ball on the ground a lot. So some of that could actually be real.
And Schwarber's strikeout rate at 27%, there were only 20 qualified batters with a 27% strikeout rate or worse. So it's actually still sneaky bad.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that being an actual category too factors in a little bit more.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And he's getting older. It's probably only going to get worse. So I say hold Bruján. I don't love Bruján, which is why it took so long to kind of work this one out. But I say hold Bruján.
Yeah, might be the kind of trade that looks a lot better in 23 or 24, or the decision to hold Bruján looks better then than it does in 2022, because I think Schwarber crushes him for this year, even in that format with those wrinkles.
Yeah, like in that draft that DC that I did, I'm hoping for like a Manny Margot season from Bruján this year. Like something where he gets to 300, 400 plate appearances maybe and 20 steals or something.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable sort of expectation playing time wise with the way things are tracking, at least right now. Thanks a lot for the question, Jay. If you got a question for a future episode, several ways to get those in. You can email us, ratesandbarrels@theathletic.com, or you can ask a question in the comment section under this video on YouTube. We really appreciate people doing that. Help us defeat the algorithm. if you'd like to get a subscription to The Athletic, you can get 33% off the first year at theathletic.com/ratesandbarrels. You want to get in before the fantasy baseball draft kit launches in a few weeks. Make sure you have your subscription all lined up for that. If you're enjoying the show, take a moment to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and barrel up on the like button if you're watching us on YouTube. That is going to do it for this episode of Rates and Barrels. We are back with you on